evening. You are all very welcome to another week of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. Now, my guest this evening is Mark Henry. Mark is joining us to speak about his brand new book, In Fact, An Optimist's Guide to Ireland at 100. Now, Mark, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
That's great. No, thanks for the opportunity. Now, I have a complaint, Sarah, to start off.
Go on.
My sponsor's crate of wine hasn't arrived. My speaker's crate. I've had to break out my own. I'm sorry about that.
Ironically, the thank you's in the post tomorrow, but glad you're joining me for a glass of wine. So to everyone joining us here this evening, if you have any questions for Mark on social media or live with us here, type them in and we will make a point of going through them. But I have thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, Mark. It was an optimistic breath of fresh air at a time where it can be kind of difficult to find one of them. So sincerely, thank you very, very much. Now I have a million and one questions, so I'm just going to jump in, and I guess I'm curious just to set the scene first of all. So we would know you in your day job capacity as kind of part of the senior leadership team within Tourism Ireland, but just give me a little bit of background about how the book came about and what motivated you to write it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I suppose the day job is telling people what a great country is. I mean, that's the day job, right? And people love to hear Ireland's story internationally, and I really are interested to learn why Ireland has done well, because by any objective measure, as I will prove, Ireland has done really well. So I set out to prove that. But I mean, I was inspired somewhat by the book Factfulness. It was published in 2018, I think, by Hans Rosling, a Swedish guy. You can find it still in old bookshop. So his basic premise was everything you think about the world is wrong. Everyone thinks things are getting worse. That's what most people think, and it's wrong. And here's why it's wrong. And I said, yeah, I mean, he's right. In fact, Bill Gates gave a gift of the copy to every graduating American student that year. So, hey, he was enthralled by it. I said, yeah, that's true. But isn't it even more true for Ireland? Now, when I started working on it back in 3 years ago, I looked at the UN quality of life rankings, and we were fourth in the world. I said, this is a brilliant story. And I went to publish it and said, look, we're fourth in the world. Let's tell that story. And they're like, okay, great. Let's do that. Little book said yes. And I started writing it. I was working away. I was midway through, and then the new rankings came out. We're upgraded to the third. I said, right, back to the introduction, right, change that bit. And then as I was finishing things up towards the end of last year, the new ones came out. We're second in the world. I mean, second in terms of quality of life according to the UN. Now, I don't think that's in our minds. I don't think that's in the public discourse. And it's about understanding, okay, why is that the case? Why, in fact, are others looking in on us saying we're doing so well? And why are we doing so well? And in what ways are we doing so well? And explaining that picture, which I think, in the context of what's happened over the last 18 months, hopefully gives people a degree of optimism, because you look at the big picture and Ireland has a great story to tell.
Absolutely. And I think you've done it in such a welcoming and kind of digestible way in kind of identifying 100 remarkable achievements that we collectively have achieved. And I think one sentence that it was in kind of one of the latter chapters, you open a chapter by saying, if I had to just choose one reason why Ireland is so successful as it is today, it would be the educational revolution over the past century. So let's start with that remarkable achievement. Tell me more.
Yeah, exactly. And so in fact, if the UN said the same thing, actually, when asked why Ireland has grown so much, because our growth in their global rankings of quality of life has been greater than any nation, any developed nation, since they started tracking it. So they started the survey in 1990. You say they've been doing it nearly every year. We were 23rd when they started. Now we're second. No undeveloped nation has jumped 22 places. So they were saying, well, so why is that? Well, for them, there are three factors that they're looking at, and we'll touch probably on each of these. But I mean, one is longevity and quality of life, quality of health. So people got, the ability to contribute and to live a long life. Have they then got the income levels to sustain a high quality of life, so they're not, having to struggle for necessities, etc. And then education, have they got the personal development ability to contribute fully during that lifespan? And so they said, actually, education is where Ireland has seen the greatest growth. So yeah, like in 1990, I mean, that was when I was finishing up more or less my BA degree in psychology. At that point, only 13% of Irish adults had a third level qualification, 13%. Now it's 51. So, I mean, that's of all outlets. I mean, when I left school, I remember that, you know, in my year, it was 1 in 10 of us went on to third level. Now I look at the league tables every year, they're up to 8 in 10 are going to third level. I mean, that is transformational. It has been transformational. So much has flowed from that for Ireland in terms of attracting inward investment, etc. But in terms of literally our ability to contribute, to fulfill ourselves as human beings has actually been transformed. And that level of third level, it's the highest or second highest level in Europe, depending on how you measure
it. It's something to be incredibly proud of. And I think as you said, our ranking is it's quite nothing less than staggering. And when you're going through the book, at one point you have a blueprint for national well-being. So you feature a graph which is kind of similar to, say, Maslow's hierarchy, and at the top of this pyramid it states that self-actualization is really at the heart of a flourishing society and generating this sense of kind of meaningfulness. And it's probably quite potentially a mean question to ask, but how would you describe this sense of meaning, or what does a flourishing Ireland to you at its best look like?
Yeah, exactly. So some people might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which kind of was a basic human hierarchy of needs. What do we need? You know what I mean? We must have food and shelter in the first instance, and then we can move on to love and comfort, and then, you know, we can gradually move up to a point where we're contributing fully as human beings. And, you know, that was an individual level. And what I look at in the book, I suppose, is a lot of work has been done over the last 20, 30 years in terms of not the individual level, but the population level. What makes a population flourish? What makes a country flourish? And we look at the things that are there, actually, they kind of match onto the areas that Ireland has made a huge progress in. From that very basic in terms of income level, shelter, we might come back to housing, but the quality of housing has improved enormously in so many ways. You know, you go up that hierarchy, education, of course, are giving people the potential to fulfill themselves. Our democracy, having the ability for people to contribute to the direction of their country. I mean, again, these are the sort of factors that are I suppose, deliver a population's well-being. And have we delivered Ireland's population well-being? Yeah, well, we have, because when you ask people in Ireland, are they happy? Simple question. How happy? Are you fairly or very happy? 97% of Irish people say they are fairly or very happy. 1% say they're unhappy. Now that, in terms of happiness, is the highest level of any European country. I think people do recognize we've come a long way. Now that isn't necessarily what you see in the news cycle, but the point is, what I've tried to do from the book is draw out why Ireland has achieved more than other nations. And a lot of it falls into this. We have delivered the sort of things, not just at a person level, but at a population level, that are now being identified as leading to a flourishing society. And indeed, that very point that you make about a society that is flourishing is one of the things that is identified as leading to population well-being. It's that we live in a country where things are thriving. Now, a lot of the evidence, the facts say that is the case. Is that the news cycle? Well, we'll come to that perhaps. Okay, but this is why I've written the book. Let's take a step back. Let's look at, to look 100 years ago, but in fact, you only have to look really over the last 30. I mentioned the growth in education since the 90s. That's when we flourished, and we are flourishing society. It's not that there's not problems. It's not that we're utopia. Nowhere is. But the grounds that we've progressed. Another example, when the same EU survey asked about equality of opportunity, and asked a question about, in the last 30 years, or compared to 30 years ago, do you feel there is more equality of opportunity for you today? 80% of Irish people say yes. 80% puts us number one in Europe. We have taken huge strides forward. There's nothing to be nostalgic about in Ireland's past, really.
Well, for those of us running museums, let's not quite state that fact.
Well, it's worth understanding the past to see where we've come. Hey, hence, it's a history and a current affairs book. But yes.
Agree with you emphatically. No, I kind of, as you're touching on there, that there is facts and data, and there is kind of economic undertones to a lot of what you're talking about. And one of the ideas that you do put across quite eloquently in the book is this idea that the remarkable economic progress has delivered this higher standard of living for us than our forebears. And you might just dive in a little bit deeper on that for me.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of talk of, well, these multinationals, you know what I mean? They're on some big tax evasion game and they're delivering no benefit to Irish society. That's not the evidence. I mean, okay. So Ireland's story, and one of the core reasons why we're so successful, is obviously our opening up to the world. Mm-hmm. And that started really in the 60s, economically speaking, when we started saying, right, want to attract foreign direct investment in. Now I again, don't want to digress too much, but I do think that our whole emigration cycle also was kind of a flow of connection with the world that Ireland had, perhaps a bit more than others. And I come back to that because we've reversed that immigration tradition completely. But that opening up, that attracted inward investment, that and ultimately then attracted new talent and new immigration into the country, not immigration, immigration. Has contributed so much because, if you go for the first 60 years of Irish independence, there was never more than 1 million people in jobs. I mean, that's why there was huge immigration in the 50s, because there was a growth, people coming through, but there was no jobs. There were no jobs. And then that cycle of investment, that foreign direct investment began to come in. And all of a sudden, yes, real jobs were created. So we doubled that number of people in employment. It went to more than 2 million during the Celtic Tiger. Yeah, we had a bit of a collapse and we lost about 400,000 of those jobs. But by 2019, we had exceeded again 2.3 million people in employment pre-COVID. But we'll get back there. So the idea that, that multinational investment hasn't contributed much to Ireland, it has. And I have a quote from Professor Frank Barry in Trinity there, the economics department, who says, people have this misperception that, we don't get a lot of tax out of these companies. He said, we get an enormous amount of tax out of these companies. So, that has, of course, given us the financial capital that has enabled us to invest in so many different things. Yes, I mean, create a virtuous circle of education. We're able to invest that in education and to expand the quality, the quantity of education that enabled that, and that obviously helped fuel further inward investment. I talk about, it's important to acknowledge, I do in the book, that multinational sector has driven a huge amount of positive, but it has also spilled over in very positive ways to indigenous companies. So if you look at Europe as a whole, European Union, Ireland comes out number one as the most productive people in all of Europe, because we contribute far more, we create a lot more value for our companies than any other country. But of course, a lot of that is the multinational effect. But you take the multinational effect entirely out of that, and Ireland then comes fifth in terms of its indigenous companies. So again, there is a spillover, and it has, the talent that has developed, the investment that has given, all sorts of things has enabled indigenous companies and people to learn and to set up their own organizations and to flourish. So we are right up there and well ahead of the UK, which of course is one of the trends of the last century. It was the first 30 years we were still stuck entirely with the United Kingdom. And our story has really been one of separation and growing into our own, at the point where the last 20 years on most metrics, we are now ahead of the United Kingdom. And now the peers we need to look to, I argue, are not the UK, it's not the US even. It's our Nordic colleagues. Yeah, Norway is still number one in that UN ranking, but it's Denmark, it's Sweden, it's Finland, it's Iceland. These are the sort of people that have the same sort of success metrics at the moment as countries as we do. And they're the people I think we should learn from next to sustain the progress that we've made. There's a lot in that, Sarah. I don't know if I touched on your question directly or not.
No, it is fascinating. And it's, I guess that's kind of that idea of what we can learn from the number one is, there is an interesting wider conversation in that, but you also, you're touching on changes to emigration. You might just kind of talk us through the trends of the last kind of century in that regard.
Yeah, and I mean, right up to the 70s, really, there was no good news here. Like the 50s were the worst point, I suppose, where a third of all people in their 20s left. A third of all left, and again, I interviewed a professor in Edinburgh University. Very annoying, these names escapes me for a minute, and he was saying, the norm nearly was becoming leaving. I mean, it was nearly unusual that you were staying. Why were you staying? What was wrong with you that you were staying in Ireland? So we opened up, we joined the EU in the 70s and began to have a bit of economic growth, and all of a sudden people began to come back, and they're predominantly Irish people coming back. The 80s, we didn't manage our economy particularly well. People went out again. But then in the 90s, the opportunities began. The single European market opened up, huge opportunities. FDI flowed in, and all of a sudden there was a big need for talent. So those young Europeans were coming out, and as the IDA called the graduates of the 90s, as again we saw the benefits of investment in third level, and all of a sudden the flow began to reverse. And initially, of course, in the 90s, a lot of that was European Union, let's say Western European Union, as it was at the time, right? Western European nationalities coming in. It was British, it was French, German, and so on, Dutch. But then, of course, as the EU expanded and as our need for labor expanded, so we began to see, of course, the growth from Eastern Europe, as we called it, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Romania, to the point where, you know, if you go back to the 70s, in fact, it was around 3%, maybe 4% of the population who were living in Ireland weren't born here, 3 or 4%.
Wow.
They were primarily British. Now, it's reached the point where it's 18%. So just short of 1 in 5 people living in Ireland today weren't born here. That, again, is one of the highest figures in all of Europe. And it's great because it has fueled our economy. It is that talent that a lot of those multinationals and even our own now indigenous export-oriented companies are looking for. And by bringing those people in, it has helped us to grow to an entire other level. Now, of course, the challenge is, can we sustain that openness? Can we sustain those people coming in? Where are we going to house them? Because we're going to need to continue to see that growth in order to help feed the economy. But I think, you know, that is a story of Ireland becoming multicultural.
Yeah.
You know, because I mean, it wasn't that growing up in the 70s and the 80s, you know, you have to say it, you know, when you walk down a Collins Street, and you saw a colored person, you're like, oh my God, it's a colored person. Do you know what I mean? It was unusual. And now we have transformed, and that is for the better.
Absolutely. And I think as someone who, you know, was late 80s, 90s childhood, you know, it's the Ireland of my childhood, the progress we have made and the changes that it's really, we're heading in the right direction. It's wonderful. But like when you're talking about the world of work and its kind of relationship to each of us as individuals, like one conversation that I know a lot of people are having at present, and kind of that you do just inevitably lands as a conversation regularly, is looking at work-life balance. And I was particularly endeared to the section that you spent talking about the zoo as an insight to kind of leisure time. But I wonder, do we have much insight on how work-life balance has actually changed over the last 10 years to 100 years?
We do. I mean, you know, we are working 20% fewer hours than those in the 1970s. Yeah, it's an average, but we're working 20% fewer hours because the average in the 1970s, the average for those in work was 48 hours a week. Now, the EU directive came in, you may remember, I talk about it in the book, to then make 48 hours the maximum you could be working in a week. So, you know, over time, those who were working, in fact, 6 days a week, or might have been in 5, but were working all that hours, you know, they came back, you know. So we've also, of course, seen the growth of part-time working. Funny enough, you know, while the numbers there have doubled and tripled and quadrupled, I talk about that in the book in terms of people working 2 days a week or 3 days a week or 4 days a week. It's still actually a minority. Most people still work 5 days a week by some significant margin, but their hours are less. So in fact, we are working fewer hours for more income. Because actually our incomes are still going up in real terms. They are still going up now. People say, hey, wait a minute, what about commuting? You know, it's taking a lot longer these days, so we have to drive from Kildare, whatever. And that is true. I put 100 facts in the book, 100 remarkable achievements. I looked at many more. One of the ones I looked at was commuting times. You know, were they up, were they down, what was the trend? Actually, over the last 20 years, they've been fairly stable. They have been fairly stable because, sure, some people are having to drive long distances, but there's been a lot more people returning to city centres, living in apartments, that sort of thing, or living in towns, moving in from rural areas. And that has meant a bit of a balance. So actually, overall, most people still actually only have to go 30 to 40 minutes to work, actually, every day. So yeah, for most, there hasn't been a change. But so overall, we have a lot more leisure time, as you say. I talk about Dublin Zoo as an example of that because it was hard to find statistics showing leisure time back in 1920s.
Yeah.
You know, but the zoo is, I thought, a great example because it has been there, obviously, for even longer than that. And the point is, you can track visitor numbers. They publish them every single year. So, yeah, back in 1920s, you had 100,000 people visiting the zoo every year. And, you know, a lot of them would have been well-to-do, obviously, at that point. point is they basically added 100,000 visitors roughly every single decade, to the point where now it's 1.2, 1.3 million. And they basically added that, and again, I interview folks who talk about what happened there. And a lot of it, of course, was the democratization of leisure time. And they talk about it because originally the zoo was a Protestant elite institution for going out there and meeting with your fellow class members to walk along the promenade and etc. And to it was all about the tea parties and the lunches they used to have at the lawn, because that was how people met each other. And of course, then what happened really in the 50s and 60s and 70s was the growth of the Catholic working class and the Catholic middle class. And all of a sudden they wanted to come, and they were coming for a different reason. They were coming to entertain the kids. And how that became the focus then. And, it was all about the elephant rides and the chimpanzee tea parties in the 60s and 70s. And then, then we began to think, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's exploiting the animals a little bit. And then it became a lot more about conservation in the 80s and 90s. But I do, to be fair, in the book, because he doesn't get a lot of credit elsewhere, and I'm not even saying I give him a lot of credit elsewhere, but Bertie Ahern saved Dublin Zoo. I write about that in that they were going completely bankrupt in the 80s. They hadn't enough money. The thing was a disaster. And he saved them, not least of all by by granting a whole lot of extra land, or by convincing the president to give them an awful lot that allowed them to expand and to modernize the habitats and to give the animals the sort of room that they needed. And of course, that itself resulted in a huge growth then in visitors after that as well. But it's just an example exactly of how, again, go back, 2 generations, things were completely different. A trip out to Dublin Zoo was your summer holiday.
Yeah.
And now it's something you've got a family pass for, and you're going 4 or 5 times a year.
Yeah. And gosh, what an amazing time, or what an amazing way to be spending some of our leisure time. It is, it's somewhere I haven't seen in years at this stage, but it'll be enthusiastically. I know I don't have children.
Yeah, you see, that's the difference.
That's the thing. But one thing that I kind of picked up on was that you do dedicate a reasonable amount of space in the book to talking about our relationship with the production of and our access to food, but also kind of its relationship between, say, diet, behavior, and disease. And you absolutely do go into crediting medical advances and celebrating that. But I kind of, you are very, very clear to highlight that we objectively are living, as you said earlier, healthier, longer, good lives. And I'd love you just to unpack a little bit more the wider relationship with food that we've had.
Yeah, indeed, there's a lot in that, exactly. I mean, both from the production side and the consumption side. So the production side, I suppose, is a rural economy. Obviously, there's been a huge transformation. That go back to the 1920s, most people were employed in agriculture. Do you know what I mean? That was the majority of the jobs. Now it's less than 1 in 10. And obviously it's just continuously on a declining curve. Yet our production has increased significantly. Our production of every type of food, crops, animals, has increased significantly. Again, yes. A lot of that is technology, tractors instead of people. It is fertilizers. It is other things that have enabled us, again, to be significant contributors. And in fact, again, one of the facts in terms of food exports, people appreciate we're beef exporters, but we are the biggest beef exporting nation in the Northern Hemisphere by volume. I mean, not per capita, by volume. We export more tons of beef than anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, that's a success story, So we have done a lot in terms of production. I was asking again the head of research in Teagasc. So why? How are we producing more beef when in fact the amount of land that we're giving over to these things is decreasing? And he said, well, they're not the same cows as they were in the 20s. We have genetically imported cows that are a lot more prone to be generating a lot more meat than those, and of course breeding and all that since then has improved enormously. But yes, there's the whole production side, which we have, like absolute transformation in terms of how our relationship with agriculture. It is a far smaller bit of our manpower, but it has remained a very huge bit of our exports. But then our consumption. And again, the consumption in the 1920s, again, speaking to experts about that, the diet of the 1920s was appalling. We think it's bad now, but we'll come to that maybe. But it was really bad in the 20s because people were moving into the cities, and at least I suppose I am speaking about those in Dublin and in the major urban areas. They were off the land, so they were eating processed foods. Processed foods, tinned foods were coming in. So people were eating pastes, they were eating margarine, they were eating jams, they were eating spreads, fatty spreads, stuff that you wouldn't even touch now. But, and lots and lots of processed food. The diet was pretty appalling. Rural areas was better, but the variety was so narrow. It's basically what they were growing themselves. Of course, there was no refrigeration. People would go to the shop daily, buy what they needed that day, and cook it that day. So it's been a huge transformation for the better in terms of our nutrition in both circumstances, because the variety of what we're eating has shot up. Again, supermarkets had a lot to do with that. Holidays had a lot to do with that. People going out into the world saying, avocado, so they're eating avocado. What's an avocado? We can get that in the supermarket, so let's have some of that. So our whole variety of foods that we eat is unbelievable. I mean, again, got some good quotes in there from people in the area. The idea that your grandparents would cook a stir fry. I mean, pasta wasn't even a thing. Where did the stuff come from? So it was completely, transformational, but for the better. So the amount of fruit and veg we're eating now, the volume is twice that what it was in our grandparents' time. Twice that. The amount of unhealthy foods. Again, good quote from somebody who's, again, the president of the Irish Heart Foundation. And she was saying how, her parents used to eat fries every day, like big fry-ups every day. And then they went, okay, let's just do it at weekends. And now they have it only at Christmas because they realized, wait a minute, that diet maybe not delivering longevity. There's been huge improvements, again, for the better, actually, in the main, across the board. And now, of course, yes, the danger, and I have a chapter on the risks as we head into the next century, is that we're eating too much. The calories are too accessible, and that the bad stuff is promoted a bit too much for us. And obesity is a threat on doing some of that stuff in the decade or century ahead. So we got to watch out.
Yeah, and I guess there's both climate implications as well as health implications in that regard. Like my favorite apples come from New Zealand, which
I mean, and those avocados, I mean, I'm a big fan because I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. But, the point is, I know we have to be conscious of the footprint. But I think, and again, as I look out in the chapter towards the end about those challenges for the next century, we weren't thinking of natural environment, or the environment. We weren't really thinking of it. I mean, there's a chapter in there because I make the case that we are becoming increasingly environmentally aware. I mean, the recycling rates are good. Our use of wind power, et cetera, to create electricity has shot up in 20 years massively. We're on the right path. Our homes and the quality of them in terms of insulation, energy has shot up in 20 years. We are making huge strides. But we didn't really appreciate that was a cost that we were extracting from the environment. So our CO2 emissions per capita are the third worst in Europe. And again, when I spoke to the head of the Environmental Protection Agency about that, like what's going on there, she was saying, well, for other countries, they were very reliant on industry. So they could introduce new technology and that dealt with them. They saw huge reductions in CO2 emission. For us, the majority is agriculture, along with transport, and we haven't tackled it yet. So some challenges as we go into the century ahead.
I dare say that is in the challenges, which I will get to in a little while. But I think one thing you have touched on, and is something that is kind of impacting every family and individual around the country, I would imagine, is the topic around housing and the roof over our heads. And the facts that I saw in the book was Dublin city and county was home to nearly 500,000 people at the time of independence. It's now home to some 850,000 more, and that we've transformed from a largely rural to a much more urban environment. And would you talk us through the kind of real world impact of a statement like that?
Yeah, exactly. So at the time of independence, 2/3 of people lived in rural. I mean, not in towns or villages, never mind cities. Rural environment. And now it's switched entirely. So two-thirds are in urban environments. Of which a quarter in Dublin. And of course, what is Dublin? I mean, obviously, there's the greater Dublin area in neighbouring counties, which isn't even counted in that quarter. So we've undergone that huge transformation, for good reason. I mean, it's not unique in that. In fact, again, Ireland is still one of the least urbanized places in all of Europe. We still have a way to go, and we're probably going to go there. I mean, we can discuss the impact of COVID and working from home, working wherever we like, and all that. But cities are where you have a higher, generally more jobs available at a higher skill level. Generally speaking, there's better services, better transportation, better health services, etc., and better crack, better social environment, there's strong communities in cities and in suburban areas. There's no evidence of anything to the contrary. So people like to move there. They like to move there. And again, when people immigrate to the country, they're far more likely to end up in an urban area. So we're going to continue to see a transformation. And of course, we need to find ways to house all those folks. But I think, we still have a way to go in terms of that urbanization. Again, Dublin's story, we talk about the housing quality has improved enormously. I mean, you go back to the 1920s, is not just exclusive to Dublin, but the point is that most people were living in housing that was 1 or 2 rooms, most people, and yet the average household size was 4 or 5 people in those 1 or 2 rooms. Now it has flipped entirely, in the sense that we now have most people live in houses or accommodation that has 5+ rooms, I'm not counting bathrooms, 5+ rooms, and there's only 2 to 3 people in them. On average, is 2 to 3 people in that house. So we've gone through this huge improvement in terms of quality of housing. But yes, we're clearly facing a situation where there's not enough of it. And the challenge for me there, if I'm digressing slightly, is that again, one of the reasons why Ireland's been so successful, I believe, is our strength of community. We have good, strong interpersonal trust between people. It's very high in this country. We have a good sense of fairness and equality as a result. We don't have as divisive a society as there might be in other places. We don't have the same extremes of rich and poor, actually. So over the last 20 years, income inequality in Ireland has decreased. It has decreased. So, I mean, in 2019, it's the lowest level it ever had been pre-COVID. So the point is, we have good cohesiveness, and we've worked together to help all boats grow. But that is the threat of housing. If there's now a whole generation of feel disconnected, or there's them and us, and we're not getting a fair shot that they had, that's a threat to our social cohesiveness, and that isn't going to help us continue to overcome the challenges as we go into the century ahead. So for me, that's something obviously that's a priority to address. I've covered a few areas there, Sarah. I'm not sure if I specifically answered your question.
You have, absolutely, and I think the conversation around housing and I guess wealth as well, which you were touching on there, and opportunity is really, that is definitely not something that we are at the solution for yet. And I think you do kind of name it as one of the challenges. We might I'd like to come back to that and ask you about it. But I think just before we move into the challenges, it was fascinating the way that, having outlined so many remarkable accomplishments, you do actually stop for a minute to kind of go, okay, cool, we've done a lot of good things. This is how and why we've done those things. But there's still people that don't believe it. Or there's still moments where we struggle to accept it. And
this is the psychologist in me coming out there, Sarah. Exactly. Because, absolutely, so you read this sort of guy and hang on. And, come back to, I talked about the book Factfulness at the beginning. And that was the whole point of Rosling, was, you're not getting it. And here's why you're not getting it. And, I built on what he's done, I suppose, and identified in the book the 5 leading psychological biases that prevent us appreciating positive progress. And now it's not unique to the Irish. That's the point. It's not unique to the Irish. It's kind of a species thing, really. I mean, if we, in the past, to the ancestor who spotted the lion in the jungle first, who was able to run the fastest, was the one who survived to tell the tale. So we are prone to seeing danger. We are tuned to seeing risk, because we want to manage it, we want to deal with it, so we keep surviving. And that, I mean, it's well documented psychology. There's a negativity bias in nearly anything. We listen and respond a lot more to negative feedback than we do to positive feedback. We look at negative news a lot more than positive news. The news cycle, in a way, is only giving us literally what we pay attention to. Again, talk about some studies of that in the book, where people are sat down in front of computers and they have equal numbers of negative and positive articles. And people all inevitably go towards the more negative ones, even when they say, oh, the media is full of negative stories, I don't like it. They still go to those stories. So, so we do have that negativity bias. We also have a relatively short attention span as human beings, by which I mean that, and again, of course, going back a long time, I'll go back more than a few hundred years. We didn't need a long attention span. The average lifespan was 35 years.
Yeah.
You know, up until the 1800s. You just need to reproduce. That was it. Well done, and off you went. And the point was, again, life wasn't any different than it was to your parents, to your grandparents. So so we didn't develop the ability to really to think long term. We didn't need to. There wasn't a lot of change happening. So again, we again, good research has been done to say, well, what is the attention span that humans have for change? Some good work done recently in MIT and University of California showed that at least when it came to the weather, they analyzed tens of millions of tweets that people were tweeting about the weather in the States. And they said on average, people can only compare to 5 years ago. They only say, oh, it's a lot hotter than it was for the last couple of years. Really hot compared to 10 years ago, it doesn't even register. So we find it difficult to think about change beyond a kind of a 5-year attention span, which again is why you kind of need to sit back every now and again and look at the big picture, just remind ourselves that actually things are a lot better when you step out of the short term. And of course, again, the technology that we have at our disposal now can lead us down that kind of doom scrolling thing, right? I have to say that was a new word to me, doom scrolling in my research. But this idea, you're just sitting there on the phone all the time, you're just scrolling through the negative. Because, hey, when I was, younger, we had 6 TV channels. The news was on at 6, it was on maybe at 9 or 10. That was it. You missed it. That was it. You might catch it 3 minutes on the radio at the hour, but you had to wait for the newspaper the next day to see what else happened. And you had to wait another day to see what else happened. So you didn't have the access to news, which is fine. It's good. It's better. But you have to be conscious that if you absorb too much of it, because that is your natural inclination, it can lead you down a negative path. So again, I talk about some research that was done by social researchers who looked at the people who were doom scrolling, who were following the news cycle around the terrorist attack on the Boston Marathon. And they found that people who were doing that had higher levels of anxiety than people who knew someone who was there, and people who had a friend or relative at the terrorist attack, because they were just never switching off and what's happening, and following this and getting worked up about it. So we can do that now. That access to news is a good thing, but being conscious of its impact on us, it leads us to think things are getting worse. There's a lot more negative news around. There's not. There's actually less of it, actually. But your access to it and your ability to hear about it is amplified. You never had a generation that can hear bad news at the flick of a switch. And because that's what you pay attention to, that's what they're serving you, because that's what gets your seconds of attention. I'm going to put an ad around that.
And it's an amazing thing. This is something that I would talk to kind of young students that we interact with in the museum about, this idea that the growing up with that level of constant presence and exposure is probably not something I envy them for, if I'm honest. But when you're going through the kind of negative psychological biases, as you've so beautifully pointed out, or kind of explained to us there, you do talk about this idea that good progress is objectively quite slow in how it happens. Therefore, it can be less easy to find the good wins and the happy news to share. But then, as you said, the constant doom scrolling and the negativity being kind of immediately present. But also, you talk about this idea of us building up an objectively reasonable sense of distrust if we found ourselves previously being either misled or feeling that information is being misrepresented in how it's given to us. And I guess to the psychologist in you, I'm kind of wondering, and I'm curious on your views of how do we rebuild trust? How do we rebuild celebrating of the good in a mindset?
No, it's good. I mean, I think Ireland's at a different place from some other countries. I'm going back to that. We still have high levels of interpersonal trust and a good sense of community in Ireland that we should preserve, because this is the point. If we nurture the things that got us here, then we can, continue to tackle the challenges that face us well. We don't want to do stuff that disintegrates that sense of community, that introduces instability, because again, we've been a democracy for 100 years. We've got good functioning states of institution, and we want to preserve that. We don't have the swings to conservative, Labour, Republican, Democrat. We don't have that, and that is a positive in terms of stability. It's encourage people to invest, encourage people to start businesses. That's a good thing. So I do have to admit, point the finger a little bit at social media in the sense that it has got out of hand. I mean, if people said, some of the stuff that says people say on social media face to face, there needs to be a Barney or there be a court case, so maybe both. So the point is, regulation of social media, just making people accountable for what they say is reasonable, and that will help moderate the discourse. Again, we want to encourage people into politics. We want to have good representative politicians. But seriously, the virtue, the vitriol that politicians are facing through social media, the negativity in terms of what they're hearing all the time is not accurate, actually, and is not conducive, because we want to have a broad political base, not obviously in particular. I call out the positive that we have had a female president more than nearly anywhere else in the world. So our two female presidents at 21 years as head of state puts us third in the world in terms of length of female leadership. But on the other hand, our representation of women in the Oireachtas is actually shockingly poor. I mean, it's one of the worst in the developed world in terms of the percentage of women we have in the Dáil in particular. So there's, but we have to address that negative commentary. We have to balance it. So part of it is regulation of social media. Part of it is policing as part of that. Are the Gardaí really up to speed in terms of what's happening in terms of online hate speech? I mean, when have you last seen a prosecution around that? So I think there's a good way to go in that. I do believe, in truth, that a lot of those social media companies are waking up to that sort of thing. It's not driven by Ireland per se. It's driven, as you can see, by developments elsewhere. But I think that is part of the solution. But ultimately, I believe recognizing what has got us here and nurturing that as we go forward is what is ultimately critical, because it's through the strength of community, as I say, the stability as a nation, our investment in education, our openness to the world. These are the things that have got us here. To in some way back away from any of those or to undermine them is not going to deliver a long-term positive impact for us, because overall we're doing well. We've more to do. But unless we sustain things that got us here, we're not going to be able to tackle this problem as well as a nation going forward.
And when you talk about kind of coming together as a nation, there's a very lovely warm fuzzy section in the book in which I can't remember what month you're referencing, but you do kind of a snapshot of kind of community involvement over the course of a 4-week period. And you talk about the fact that over the past month, 69% of people in Ireland had donated to a charity, 62% had helped a stranger, and 28% had volunteered their time in some way. And this came to the observation that we are the most generous people in kind of measurable ways in Ireland or in Europe. And I guess one of the ideas that we talk about and think about an awful lot in the museum is this idea of civic pride. And I wonder, to you, is that generosity, is that a virtue of civic pride, sense of community, or what would you attribute that behaviour to?
Yeah, exactly. So the point you're making, exactly, it is there based on 10 years worth of research of nations around the world in terms of those things, in terms of generosity, basically. In Europe, we're the top. We're 5th in the world. If we like to think we're generous people, it is true. It is objectively true and called out, so referenced in the book. Now, the point, so in fact, let me expand a little bit on that, because also the second point later, when we look at overseas development aid, and again, per capita, we are right up there with the US and Canada as the top 3 nations in the world in terms of contributing to other nations' development in terms of personal donations, not government donations, personal donations to development overseas. So I think we have a good track record. I think there are several factors at play here. I mean, I think when I think of that overseas development aid, there is obviously a strong tradition with missions, particularly some religious orders, of course, I'm talking about, that have gone overseas and helped education. And of course, all of our education going back was tied to religious bodies who were fundraising, therefore, to help overseas in a very positive way. It opened Ireland's mindset to that, such that indeed when Ireland had a whole volunteer program, as it did in the 70s and 80s and 90s, for people to go overseas and to help developing countries. Again, we had huge uptake, tens of thousands of people who went to those programs. And again, I look at the current UN volunteering nations in the world. And again, Ireland is in there top 5 in terms of UN volunteers even today. So we have had that good program. I think the church has been part of that, actually, very positively in that respect. Also, I think emigration has opened us up to the world. We had these connections around the world, relatives in other places that were feeding through what was happening elsewhere. So I think that gave us a degree of generosity of spirit. Other people helped us out, and we have a tradition of helping other people out. And that is a positive dynamic that we have actually fostered and sustained to this day. So I think those are kind of historic factors that played a part in it. But I do think that, when it comes to it, it is indeed part of our strength of community. It is the fact that, we don't have, as I will maintain, a significant elite versus the rest of us. We're all in this together. And even I would point to doing the book to the GAA and the role it has played in facilitating, community engagement and building a sense of community around the country. I mean, it's actually remarkable, I think, that GAA is our number 1 favorite sport and our number 1 most participated in sport. Because, who else plays it? Nobody else plays it. I mean, that could have just gone by the way in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, or, we're a developed nation. Now we play soccer or basketball or, whatever. No, we do all that. But still, GAA is number 1. And obviously the GAA has been a very successful organization in grounding itself in communities. Not the only one. I mean, soccer clubs and many others, of course, as well. But I think that sense that we have of we're in this together, and a sense of fairness, and as somebody said to me recently, just decency. In fact, it was Professor Luke O'Neill, who I was doing an event with at the Dublin Book Festival, and he was talking about a colleague of his who emigrated, and he came back and he said, you know what, it's just a thing when I come home to Ireland. He said, there's a sense of decency with the Irish, and whatever you call it, to me, that's social cohesion. That's our strong sense of social capital we have in this country, and that's worth preserving. And it comes from some of that stuff, and it's feeding off that stuff, and that's very valuable. That's very valuable. We're a small country as well. Again, I interviewed Shane Coleman, who was giving me lots of perspective on politics and our democracy today. And he said, look, in truth, it's easier for Macron to close a hospital in Lyon than it is for Micheál Martin to close a hospital in the Midlands, because we're a small country, but because in fact our politicians are close to the people because of our proportional representation system, and that is a good thing. They know what our concerns are, they know what our issues are. They're not distant from it, they're not some elite, and they are generally, I would argue, politicians have done a good job for us in the main over the 100 years, because otherwise we wouldn't be second best in the world by the UN. They have in the main done well by the people of Ireland, because they're of the people of Ireland. They're not different from them, and that's a strength.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's you've kind of just, you so succinctly brought so many parts of Irish life and kind of contributors to our success into that one statement. And I'm loving to hear you actually mention the GAA, because it's kind of, again, they're an organization that we would talk about so regularly, what they've managed to accomplish and how they've managed to actually become a part of a community. Like we've had the conversation more than once, which has gone, how do we be 1% of what that is within our community? And that would be something I'd be quite proud of. But listen, I think this is a book full of optimism and the good at its finest. But I think one of the greatest virtues of this book is the fact that you go through all that is optimistic, the things that affect our negative, our kind of pessimistic outlooks, and kind of why we sometimes default to the bad. But then you don't shy away, you name the challenges, you look at the fact that we are not perfect, we are not the finished product. And I guess just to touch on them, I wonder if you might introduce me to what you would consider to be some of the biggest priorities and challenges that you've named within the book.
Yeah, exactly. We're not a utopia. Exactly. We're never going to be, right? Because there'll be new challenges that can go, but there'll be stuff all the time. We'll need to progress and tackle, and of course there will be. So we're not perfect, of course, but yeah, I mean, so I call it 10 challenges for the decade of the century ahead. Whether we've touched on some of them, I mean, touched on housing and its challenge in terms of the social cohesiveness we've got. I would say, like, also I've talked so much about education, yet the investment in education by the government per student is half what it was before the Great Recession, because they cut back on third level investment, obviously, in the Great Recession. They haven't really restored it, but student numbers have continued to grow and grow and grow. So in fact, nearly every single Irish third level institution has dropped in the global rankings, some hugely. Technological University of Dublin's dropped 400 places in global rankings. UCD, Trinity down 20, 30, 40 places. Galway's the exception. Fair use them, they've grown. But the point is, we're not investing in our future. We're not allowing, the quality, never mind the quantity, the quality of education to come through. I touched on obesity earlier. We've now reached a point where 2/3 of us are either overweight or obese. And that it builds up health problems for the challenges ahead. Just as like there was a 20 to 30 year lag between smoking increasing and then lung cancer cases increasing, and then 20 to 30 year lag the other way around. Smoking began to decrease before lung cancer began to decrease. Obesity, it's a warning sign, potentially, could be leading us to undo some of that longevity and other progress we've made. But I mean, there are others, of course. I mean, we're earning more than ever. So we're earning 5 times more than our grandparents in real terms. Unlike other countries, we are continuing to see increases in real income. However, more income means more expensive place to live. So the higher costs, there's more money in the economy. Yeah. So we are the second most expensive place to live in the EU after Denmark. And childcare in particular, we're in the top 5 in the world for childcare costs. So that's really bad. It's really bad because it does put a limit on, in particular, let's face it, women's entry into the workforce and being able to fulfill their own potential. So one of my favorite graphs in the book, I talk about women's participation in the workforce. I talk about the big crossover. 1996 was the year, because there's this lovely X graph where go back to the 70s, you had 70% of women primarily involved in home duties and 25% roughly in the workplace. And then you had this gradual change over 1996, it was 50-50, and now it's gone the other way. So you have less than 2 in 10 women full-time at home duties now. But it hasn't quite hit the same level as men's participation in the workforce. So there still is a gap there, and childcare is a significant barrier, and the cost of that is a significant barrier. We do need to find a way to fix that again. So these are some of the challenges, and I accept there are lots of things we want the government to do. I call out the fact that they're also in quite a lot of debt, relatively speaking. So because primarily of the economic crisis, going back to the Great Recession, the government now owes roughly €50,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. And again, that puts us right up there in the top division with the US and Italy and Belgium and a few others that are right up there. So we do have a real debt burden that we do need to shift. So I accept government doesn't have wonderful room to maneuver. But on the other hand, again, these are some of the challenges. We need to take that down. Obviously, we need to pay that debt back. Part of it will be through investing in education, will be in solving the housing crisis, so we can not just deal with the people who are here, but bring in more people to help sustain the economic growth that will deal with that sort of problem over time. But we can't be complacent, because the final one I talk about is that our participation, our voting in elections is nearly at one of the lowest levels it's been at. So between the general election we most recently had and the one immediately before the Great Recession, those who only had about just less than 2/3 of people voting. That was the lowest figure since nearly the foundation state. There was the first election after the foundation state was worse, but that's it. Like in 90 years, that's the lowest level. And that's complacency in a way. If we don't vote for people who are going to give us the best potential future, who support the sort and will nurture the stuff that has got us here, then hey, we stand to potential to go off the rails. So you need to keep voting, keep encouraging more and more people to vote, because it does matter. We have a proportional representation system which keeps the politicians close to the people. They are concerned with who votes for them and what voters say. So if you're not a voter, you're out of the picture. So honestly, that's a really important part of being invested in our future.
And I guess in the same way that you were talking a moment ago about trying to build an ecosystem where we get more women actively and enthusiastically participating in politics, the same is true for getting individuals out into the voting booth. And I was going to ask you what you thought the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the challenges that could be addressed were, but I dare say that is potentially it. But
I didn't pick an easy list of 10, Sarah. You know what I mean? I picked the ones were thorny ones that we've got to, that won't be easily solved. But, we have never had a generation of Irish people as educated, as wealthy, as healthy, as able to tackle the challenges ahead of us. So that, to me, I end the book on a note of optimism. I end the book with a quote that I found in a study of 142 countries in terms of levels of optimism. And the authors concluded that, the most optimistic people in the world, they said, appear to be economically secure, well-educated young women in Ireland. So more than anywhere else in the world, they said those appear to be the most optimistic groups. We never had more of them before. So, we're well placed to tackle these challenges.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, as you say, we have these freedoms, we have these securities, these opportunities. There's so much going for the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I think in looking at all of this, I was only speaking to my colleague Trevor White earlier, who I know that you're familiar with, who was on the board of Tourism Ireland for a number of years. And we got talking about this idea that, has Ireland, and I say that as kind of a country or as a tourism industry, depending which hat you wear when thinking about this question, have we ever had to deal with something like quite as similar to COVID before? And kind of, are there lessons that we can and should be taking to apply to us now?
Yeah. So I see Trevor has put in a comment there that's been quite positive. I don't know, it's been too flattering there altogether. But I have to say, I blame him for part of this book. I was speaking to Trevor when I was thinking of writing it, you see, and I came up, I said, Trevor, how about this? I'm thinking of this idea, like the 10 trends that changed Ireland in its first century. And he said, oh, no, it's a century. Why don't you do 100 things that changed Ireland? So, okay.
It's like Trevor.
Yeah, I thought it's a great idea. Publisher loved the idea, right? But on the other hand, that I didn't appreciate, increased my workload tenfold. Thanks, Trevor. But no, thanks. Here we are. But sir, I've completely forgotten what you asked me about the other ones.
What can we learn from the past?
Oh yeah. The challenges. Because you see, if you think about it, think of the pictures in your school textbook of Ireland in the 1920s. Like they were, tenement kids running around Dublin, barefooted. They were the rural cottage with a family of 11 in the 2-bedroom cottage. There were, from the start, there was the poverty that Ireland took a while to overcome. We talked about emigration. In the 50s was obviously this huge, it was like the peak of it in terms of emigratory wave. But again, we've completely turned the tide on. I was talking somewhere else this morning about inflation. In the 1970s. In 5 years, prices doubled due to inflation, and in the next 5 years, they doubled again. So in 11 years, prices increased fourfold. And there was huge unemployment. As the Boomtown Rats and others wrote about. There were Banana Republic. There were huge problems at the time that we overcame. So I think we have, and never mind the most recent recession. I'm not saying it hasn't left scars. Of course it has. It doesn't mean everybody's overcome the situation. But we, economically speaking, back to pre-COVID, we were exporting more than ever before. We had more employment than ever before. Our unemployment level was really, really low, in a global context. So, we've come a long way. So, to me, I was speaking about it this morning. So I think we can, all of this positions us really well to overcome the COVID challenge. In fact, some sectors of the economy haven't stuttered at all. Speaking, in terms of the COVID impact on the economy. So, we are really looking forward. Hospitality tourism has been particularly hard hit. Of course it has. So I think, that isn't going to recover immediately. The central bank says that within 2 years, we'll be back to the employment level we were in 2019. I think for tourism, okay, it's a little bit more 4 years, perhaps, before we get everybody back. But, tourism isn't stopping. Ireland is not a less attractive place by any means. We are going to see all of this recover as long as we address those fundamentals to keep us driving forward. Now, I do see a question from Eric, I'm only sponsoring it now, on the Q&A, saying, given that we've declared climate change and biodiversity loss as crises in Ireland, why so optimistic? Production and exporting lots of beef is not sustainable if we were to address climate change. And I think, as a vegetarian, absolutely right. Do you know what I mean? Now, I mentioned I was speaking to the head of Teagasc had a research director, and he was saying, well, actually, like in Ireland, we only consume 10% of the beef we generate. So in fact, if every Irish person became vegetarian in the morning, we'd only have to grow exports by 10%, and we'd be shipping everything. Because, of course, there's a huge load of growth that's happening in Asia and other nations where, of course, consumption is increasing hugely. I mean, I just take a great interest in this area. I do think, in fact, the biggest challenge isn't that, and the solution and the challenge for Irish agriculture is the same, which is the growth of meat, differently originated meat, lab-grown meat. More than vegetarianism, lab-grown meat is what is going to be transformative. In the next 10 years, our chicken nuggets are going to be grown in labs, not from real chickens. And that is great for the chickens. That is great for the environment. That's why I'll be quite happy to have one, because no problems with that. That solves all the problems I'm concerned about. But that is a great challenge for Irish farmers, which is why there is a real incentive, genuinely, for Irish farming to migrate soon towards more sustainable alternatives. I mean, the money now is in beef and in milk. We should absolutely, milk that for all it's worth, in one sense. But and change how we're producing it. But longer term, into about 10 years, there are real transformations happening. And looking at how we change our land use and all of that in the next decade, is really part of Ireland's solution. And hey, we're up for it. I mean, a lot of people say, well, the trees we have in Ireland today, they're not native. Yeah, but hang on. When the state was formed, 1% of our land was covered by forestry. Now we're up to 11%. There's a potential to double that again. Yeah, why not? So we're on a journey, and we've a lot further to go. But I think we know what we've got to do. And I think the ability to face up to those challenges, as I say, we've never been better equipped to do it.
Well, your fellow vegetarian looks forward to watching the process. But I think, Mark, this has been fascinating. I would very happily sit here for another hour and continue to pick your brains. But I think my final question is really, to you personally, when you look to the future of Ireland, what are you most optimistic about? If you to name one thing.
Oh God, one thing. I honestly think it's addressing that climate and biodiversity challenge. All right, we are laggards. We're not even close to the EU average yet. But when I look at it, I personally, I watch it closely. Our potential, for example, to be a net generator of carbon neutral energy for Western Europe is huge. We obviously have that huge bank of sea around us and offshore wind potential. I'm totally in favor of onshore wind too, but the offshore wind potential, we haven't begun to get into solar. Yeah, you can generate huge amounts of electricity through solar, particularly in the summer when the wind isn't growing. We have gone in 20 years from having 5% of our electricity generated from renewable resources, which was the dam over in Ardna Crusha in Shannon giving us some electricity, to now 30%, primarily through wind. We have the ambition to drive that to 70% within 10 years. I think we can. And I think we can go beyond that. And we can create grids that is then exporting that to Britain and to France and to other nations that are going to need to use our wind energy to sustainably drive their own growth. I really think there is a new natural resource that we have the ability to be an exporter in here that offers dramatic potential for Ireland. It'll take 10 years to develop what we need ourselves, and then the next 10 really has the potential to be transformative as a new source of wealth. Norway, we mentioned, they're number one in the UN ranking. They had the advantage of oil for the last 30 years to fuel their economic growth. We have the potential for renewable energy to be bringing us to the next level. Maybe we can top that chart and beat Norway in 20 years' time if we do the right thing with it.
No, I dare say the optimist says, watch this space. So I think my colleague Trevor White posted a comment earlier saying that this is a delightfully positive conversation and that, Mark, you genuinely are a tonic. And I echo every word that he's just said there. And I think as we recover our sector, having voices like yours doing it publicly for us is wonderful. But for now and for this evening's conversation, we were chatting about, in fact, an optimist's guide to Ireland at 100. And to anyone who needs a pick-me-up, I dare say at this particular moment in time, it is one. So Mark, sincerely, thank you so much for that. And to everyone who's joined us this evening, thank you again for being with us for 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. So Mark, thank you and good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Signed copies available from the Little Museum website. Order them there. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Good night.